I'm starting the cameras. Everyone good? Okay, good to go.
The following audio exclusive features an uncut conversation with Professor Kimberlé W. Crenshaw. From our episode, Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw and Soledad O'Brien call out the media on critical race theory.
The right wing seem to have found their new wedge issue, this time with an explicitly racist lens, critical race theory. The simple idea that the US's laws affect different people differently according to their race, that the law isn't race neutral, if you will, has suddenly become a talking point for GOP activists and increasingly the mainstream media. And it's bringing a lot of heat to school board meetings across the country and debates over school funding and curricula. As of this filming, 6 states have passed laws that stem from this furor. School board members and their families have been threatened, and teachers have even been fired. Needless to say, the people doing the most of the talking on critical race theory have not been the lawyers and the scholars who invented the term, or anyone who seems to know much about it. But like allegations of political correctness in the 1990s, this is sowing division and stoking fears. So what is critical race theory actually? And why are some people so obsessed with it? How could journalists and the media companies they work for do a better job of correcting all the disinformation? To begin to answer some of those questions, I'm going to speak with UCLA and Columbia Law professor Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw, whom the New York Times once called critical race theory's chief theoretician. My old friend Kim, do you think that's fair? Are you the chief theoretician of critical race theory?
No, there's no chiefs over here, but I was one of the ones that created the first workshop and created the term critical race theory. So I guess I'm kind of inside the bullseye on this one.
Well, you certainly are. So take us back there. I mean, it almost goes back to when we first met, the late 80s. You were with a group of people talking about this, professors mostly, and you authored a Harvard Law Review piece that in some quarters is called the kind of manifesto of critical race theory. Can you talk about the conditions of that time and what gave rise to this work?
Well, yeah, it feels like ancient history now. But we were, Laura, part of what I consider the second generation of civil rights activists and students. We occupied the institutions after the sort of formal segregationist period was deemed to be over. Now, of course, Harvard Law School was not one of the places that we had to deal with the immediate consequences of having been a formally segregated school. It wasn't like the University of Texas, for example, that used to exclude African Americans altogether. But what we did learn and what we did understand is that the liberal institution was not one in which the issues around race found their way into the curriculum. They just didn't think it was important. Many of us had gone to Harvard Law School to study with Derek Bell, author of the famous Race, Racism, and American Law, only to find that he had left and that there were no plans to teach his course. So our goal was to seek the kind of education that would allow us to be helpful in the ongoing struggle for racial justice, the ongoing struggle to dismantle the consequences of white supremacy. And there we learned not only that this elite institution was completely disinterested in educating us to fulfill those roles, we also learned that the thinking about the relationship between race and law was dramatically underdeveloped. So critical race theory grew out of this second generation civil rights formation, looking at how race and racism wasn't just an issue that the law sometimes came in and tried to provide remedies against. The law was often the thing that created the very problem that it was then purporting to solve.
So give us an example. What was one of those that you remember that you hold out as sort of encapsulating that problem, that issue?
So one is that, the very idea that race is a natural category is a false idea. Race is what we call socially constructed, namely race is a product of laws, of practices, of institutions, and law itself actually help constitute what race means. So here's an example: Plessy versus Ferguson is the fundamental case that determined that racial segregation was perfectly constitutional. Everyone knows the case for that. But the other argument that Plessy was making was that it was unconstitutional for him to be considered to be Black because Plessy was 7/8 white. You couldn't look at Homer Plessy and see that he was an African American. So he was basically arguing the law was constituting the very categories of Black and white and was doing so in an asymmetrical or discriminatory way. Well, the court said you don't even have standing to make that argument because you aren't white, right? You haven't lost anything by being classified as Black because you aren't white. But it was a circular argument because the law was the thing that determined that he wasn't white. These are the kind of ways that racism and racial power not only became embedded in the law, but they were products of law itself. We basically, as critical race scholars, have looked at how racism has been embedded in the law ever since. And Homer Plessy was just one example of countless ways that law made the fiction of race materially real. So when these critics of critical race theory say that we're the ones that believe in race essentialism, it is evidence, that they have no idea what they're talking about, or if they do, they don't mind lying about what our project really is. Anyone who reads critical race theory knows that the whole project is to resist the essentialist idea of race by giving people a sense of the constructedness of race and law's role in it.
And when you say read critical race theory, are you referring to the reader that you were one of the editors of, the collected writings?
Well, yes, that people could start there. It's the big red book called Critical Race Theory, and there are other texts as well that people can read. One by Kiara Bridges, another by Richard Delgado. So these are what I have started to call, now that the right has tried to take our term and gentrify it, I call this like sort of the classical critical race theory documents. They are the articles and the arguments that come out of the law focused ways that race and racism have been constituted. Now, critical race theory, the idea of how to read race as not natural but constructed, is part of disciplines as widely distributed as geography, as sociology, political science. So the basic ideas that we took up in law are also ideas that other scholars and other teachers, other thinkers have taken up as well. And of course, now the issue is the ways that these ideas are being taught in K through 12. So while that's not classic critical race theory and that it doesn't deal with law, it does deal with the way that race has been constructed in history. So that you can find materials pretty much everywhere.
So, I mean, I just have to point out that when Florida Governor Ron DeSantis refers to his own standing up in favor of educational viewpoint diversity and against what he described as a stale ideology, he's referring to something that is relatively new, that was quite controversial at the time, has been around long enough to be stale. And although you've been very expansive here, it's not generally the stuff of K through 12 education.
Yeah, I mean, if I had my book with me, I would hold it up and I'd say, do people really think that this big red book is being taught to second graders? I mean, it's a ridiculous, claim, but they are not bound to the truth in any way. In fact, one of the main agitators has said, he doesn't give an expletive about what critical race theory really is. What they realize is that this is a container into which they can pour all of their anxieties, all of their anger, to distract and deflect from the fact that there really is no agenda that the Republicans have other than holding on to power and trying to make it permanent. And they're doing it in a classic way. They're suffocating democracy, and they're saying, hey, look over there, critical race theory. Yeah. And unfortunately, too many people are falling in line. I think, Laura, it can't be surprising that the base is easily mobilized in this way. What is surprising, and I think it is something that we really have to talk about, is what are the conditions of possibility such that this attack has happened in a way that right. The other side is completely unprepared to respond to.
Right. So you've raised a lot of things there. I mean, one is there are some very real base motivating and mobilizing efforts happening around this issue that are having very real effects in school board in school board elections, on school board members. We've seen people quit. We've seen people be fired who are teachers. We'll talk to one in just a bit. There have been fights over curricula for years, and this seems to be another one that is as much about that as it is about anything to do with critical race theory, although obviously they're connected. But this fight over the curriculum, can we just talk about that first? And then you're raising a super important point, which is that we have seen these kind of white lash attacks before. We should be better fueled and prepared to deal with them. We in the media, we in the public discourse, whatever you want to call that. And yet we still seem to find ourselves on the back foot every single time. And we'll talk about how that works. But first, why is the fight over school curricula and funding and teaching so important to the right?
Yeah. Well, Laura, public education remains the most significant public institution that shapes how Americans think about the country, think about its history, think about its future. Brown versus Board of Education said it clearly. The reason why integration was so important is that education is the key to preparing people to participate in what we want to call ourselves to be, a democracy. So I think there is some agreement about that from left to right. Another way of putting it is there's agreement about the idea that the truth will set you free. Where we divide is that our side wants to teach the truth and the other side doesn't. So it's not surprising then that public institutions, education in particular, have become ground zero in this moment of racial reckoning, the post George Floyd, the post emergence of Black Lives Matter, in which teachers were taking up the challenge of that students were bringing into the classroom. Help us understand why Derek Chauvin took George Floyd's life with a casualness that suggested that he knew the likelihood that he'd ever be punished for it was virtually nil. How is this more than just a question of a few bad apples? How do we think about policing and racial power over time? These are questions that have obviously been raised over the last year in particular, and teachers have rightfully taken up the challenge of exploring our history. So we could have predicted that there would be a backlash. There's never been a moment of reform in which there hasn't been a backlash, and this backlash in education happens to be on a track that's already well positioned. The attack on public education through vouchers, the attack on public education through fights about the curriculum, fights against teachers. All of this is a familiar foe, and now that they've thrown race as a grenade over against the teachers, it's almost too easy. My colleague Luke Harris calls it's like rolling a ball down the hill.
Yeah.
our challenge is to try to figure out how we can push it back in the other way.
Well, we shouldn't have been surprised. You're totally right. We have been here before. You and I have been involved in these struggles and these discussions, I think, for the entire time we've known each other, which is many decades. I mean, I could go down the list. In the 80s and 90s, it was political correctness and the gay agenda, the war on Christmas, the defense of marriage as if it was under attack, the great feminism hoax, which had to do with simply integrating our curriculum to include some women writers. The fight over unisex bathrooms, the fear that that's what the Equal Rights Amendment was going to bring into existence, Sharia law. I mean, the list is long. Can you think of one we've actually successfully defeated without a lot of sort of corpses in its wake?
Well, Laura, we've been trying to think of one for the last couple of days. I'm not sure that I have any better answers when we couldn't come up with one before. Maybe you can throw one out, but here's what I do think. We have seen this play so many times before that I hope that one of the things that our side does that allows for this to happen all the time is that we concede our territory. We abandon our structures. We say, they have poisoned the well. They've taken over our fortress. We've got to cut and run. And it has never worked. It did not work with affirmative action. It did not work with welfare. It didn't work with any of these moments, even the challenge to abandon feminism. It doesn't work when we try to hold the same agenda just under another term, because what they're doing is attacking the agenda. They're attacking the substance. The name is just the tactic that they're using, but the project is to dismantle the content of the ideas.
So on the affirmative action thing, just because for people who weren't there, there was this move to, well, let's not talk about race. That's been, the well has been so poisoned. We'll just talk about how good affirmative action is, for example, for
diversity.
white women.
We'll talk about it in terms of diversity. We'll talk about it in terms of, equal opportunity, and this was something that was talked about and sort of hammered, by our side, because the polls tell us that, Americans don't like affirmative action. Well, they tell us that because the way it was successfully framed as preferential treatment, the way the media reported it as, should we have reverse discrimination or not?
References, right.
Rather than should we dismantle the processes, the projects, the ways that institutions repeatedly reproduce certain kinds of exclusions. So this is a classic move. The right creates the story, often by lies and disinformation. They then are able to mobilize outrage, around the lie, with people who believe that the lie is true. And then when mainstream media come along, they just report the controversy rather than how the controversy itself was produced. Yeah. So we know it now. We've seen it. We've seen it now play out in 6 months. My hope is that since we've seen it so many times before, we're not going to do the okey doke this time. We're going to say, we're not going to let you define what critical race theory is any way you want so that we all go jump ship. We're not going to let you poison what beauty is being produced in our citizenry by people demanding to know more. We know truth will set us free, and we are determined to create the classrooms and the information that our citizens need to actually be able to fully participate in this democracy.
My question is, I'm totally with you, and obviously we want to air this debate for this discussion for this reason, but this isn't easy. It hasn't been easy for you. It isn't easy for people who are in the sights of a campaign like this from the right, as you've said. They have their cannons well fueled. And we have an argument that is well directed at people, yourself not so much, but many people who are vulnerable on their school boards, teaching in high schools, but even you. I mean, how does it feel to be under attack like this? And what's helpful?
Yeah. Well, it is shocking, obviously, disconcerting. I mean, every academic wants their work to be taken up and read. No academic wants to see their life's work being thrown around like a political football with no sense that one has to engage the ideas on their own. Nobody wants that to happen. And yet, I have to also say that nothing creates more demand to understand an idea than officials saying that the ideas have to be banned.
So bring it on.
Yeah, so there is that, the scarlet letter over critical race theory and intersectionality that I think, if we mobilize effectively, can create more engagement with the idea than before. I mean, there's good news and bad news, as they say. The good news is more people have heard of critical race theory in the last 6 weeks than heard about it over the last 30 years. So that's the good news. The bad news is they were introduced to it by, the right. And so the negatives are high. Our goal is to come along and say, you want to know what critical race theory is? Let's talk about critical race theory in practice. Let's talk about critical thinking about race that's happening in your children's classroom. And if it's not happening, let's talk about why it needs to happen. So, when you say what helps is, first of all, media not asking us to eat from a table that has been set by the right. And that's what's been happening for the last several weeks. Like, what is it about you guys that they don't like? What is this critical race theory, rather than what is it that is motivating the right to pour all their grievances into this frame? Who's behind this? What's the money? What's the end game? So if you're in media, asking the question about what this is about, rather than simply saying, let's turn the microphone and let's turn the camera and examine these people. And I think the other thing that is incredibly helpful is when teachers and students and parents start telling their stories about what is happening in classrooms that open the eyes, that allow us to understand our history for what it is, to imagine different futures. It's helpful to tell the stories about, I knew nothing about the Tulsa massacre, and I went to a high school in Tulsa. What is that telling us about the intention to bury our history? So let's step out with the stories of what real education looks like. And let's also, honestly, let's tell the truth about what happens in classrooms in which anti-racism is not a value. We're hearing all of these stories, most of them unverifiable, about terrible things that are supposedly happening as an expression of critical race theory. But all of us who've been through American classrooms know on a day-to-day basis some of the racist things that happen in classrooms. So let's talk about all of it. Let's give Americans a picture of what's really happening, and then let's have a fight about what should happen.
Well, we could keep talking about this for a very long time, and I would love to hear more about what you think should be happening in schools around teaching critical race theory properly. I am curious, though, to ask you the question we ask a lot of our guests. I've been trying to get beyond the point where we say another world is possible to another world is actually palpable and it's feelable. You've perceived it here or there, or in relation to this person or in this experience. Is there an experience like that for you where you think, we actually can make this systemic change? I don't just think it, but I feel it in this moment.
Yeah. I think that the very fact that we are here in this moment, Laura, and having this fight about critical race theory, makes me realize that when we started this thing 30 years ago, we were actually creating something that would create dividends further down the road. We weren't aware at the time how much we were breaking with tradition and creating a new model for thinking about this. We thought we were bringing our desires and our demands into reality, but the thought that 30 years later, you know, we would be in the position to say to the whole country, this way of thinking is actually pregnant with all kinds of possibilities. We never thought that people would be saying, yeah, we teach critical race theory, and this is how and why. So sometimes, the most far-reaching progressive critical possibilities happen when you're either when you don't know it or you're in the middle of battle. So it is the thing that makes me less pessimistic about the moment. And at the same time, I have to say, um, uh, I remember when Trump was first elected, the bad news was his election. We thought the good news was, so now it's clear that all the conversations that people said we couldn't have or shouldn't have because post-racialism has to be the frame of the day, otherwise, we'll lose. People will see the folly of that argument. They will double down on efforts to show the connections between, anti-racism and authoritarianism. They'll see how the slide into further right politics has been paved by, creating a national story of patriotism that is a story of denial and myth. We thought everybody would get it. Turned out everybody didn't get it at all. So I say again right now, okay, hopefully now people will get that, the same people that brought us the lie about, January 6th are bringing us the lie about voting irregularities, are bringing us the lie about critical race theory in the classroom. And finally, they will all get that we have to push back against all of this because this is the pathway towards authoritarianism. It is our own brand of proto-fascism. I'm hoping people get it. Hoping.
Well, and because I'm talking with Kim Crenshaw, I also will point out that, of course, you're including patriarchy and misogyny and misogynoir and all of that. Misogynoir. It's no accident either that we have women of color, first and foremost, in the sightlines here. And you have been moving our debate in many directions over many years. It's always a joy to talk with you about this, even though it's so frustrating. Maybe we are making a little bit of progress.
And Laura, let me just end by encouraging people to really tell these stories. That the right always comes up with a few horrific stories, true or not, and it drives their entire agenda. We are trying to be a place where we can collect their stories, our stories. Truth Be Told is our campaign at the African American Policy Forum, aapf.org. So if you've got a story about how your way of thinking about who you are and this society was opened up by a teacher who was fearless in telling the truth, tell us that story. Or if something is being shut down, like Black History Month, or in the middle of COVID, a training about racism and healthcare was shut down. Tell us that story. We've got to start stepping into this with a concrete picture of what's at play. So check us out at aapf.org for Truth Be Told.
So we will put a link to the website at our website, and I'd love to hear some of those stories on video. Maybe we could collaborate.
Wonderful. Such a pleasure, Laura. Thanks.
Professor Crenshaw, thank you so much.